Because of the following special broadcast, The Lucy Show and The Andy Griffith Show will not be presented this evening.
Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners.
If you like comic books, then you definitely like comic art. Visit comicartfans.com to see original comic artworks and custom drawings that people have collected and posted online. Coming soon, Comic Art Fans is hosting an in-person event called the Original Art Expo that will focus on the hobby of collecting original comic art. The Original Art Expo will be held at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel in Orlando, Florida on January 26th through the 28th, 2024. They will have over 30 exhibitors and 60 comic artists. Spend the weekend in an intimate setting with some of the best creators in the world. Purchase or commission a piece of original comic art. Visit the Comic Art and Illustration Galleries. Attend the Saturday night auction and pizza party and hang out with your fellow comic art enthusiasts. The Original Art Expo is sure to be the world's premier visual storytelling art event, so don't miss out. Go to oa-expo.com to get your tickets today and visit comicartfans.com to see what comic art collecting is all about.
Hi, I'm Alex Ross.
The two pieces are sort of a type. They're both kind of recreations of artwork that existed in the 90s. In fact, this piece here for the Avengers is in most ways a recreation or a tribute to George Perez's poster version from the mid-90s, where he did a shot that featured in it a figure of Captain America that was very similar to what I've done here, positioning of the Vision or positioning of Hawkeye, and I believe a few other elements are very similar to that piece, and it's consciously so. I was building off that inspiration, but I kind of refitted my design to fill out bigger shots of the figures so that I was making a wider composition and getting in a lot of the same characters, but still not quite as many as what George himself did, because George's thing was always to try and get in the maximum amount of content into pieces that he did.
Welcome back, everybody. Time again for Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. Always happy to welcome Jim Rugg back to Word Balloon, half of the great Cartoonist Kayfabe YouTube duo that has been burning up YouTube and doing tremendous interviews and breakdowns of comics and comic magazines as well. Jim, good to see you. Welcome back.
Good to see you, John. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure, my man. I'm thrilled as always with what you're doing. You're one of the most inventive independent comic guys that I know. And, you know, I totally forgot. I was talking to Shelley Bond a couple months ago, and I told her that we had been talking lately. And she reminded me of the Plain Janes. And shame on me, Jim, I sometimes forget. That, and was Street Angel your own, or was that also part of DC and the Minx line and everything?
No, that was my own. That was something I did with my writing partner, Brian Maruka. And that's what led to Plain Janes. I believe I did a Mocha, and I think that's where Shelley Bond first became aware of my work. And I was at Mocha promoting Street Angel.
That's great, man. No, that's terrific. What's your feeling, Jim? I mean, you've done, and forgive me because sometimes I conflate your projects with Ed's. Didn't you do one of the Grand Design things as well as Ed?
Yes, I did. I did the Hulk Grand Design, and foolish me, I don't have it within arm's length to hold up. But that's my contribution to the Grand Design mythos.
Okay, and that was great, and Ed did X-Men. That's excellent and everything. Man, people are already chiming in, Jim. Chris wants everyone to know that Cartoonist Kayfabe has the Christmas in July, where they put comics in the little lending library, sometimes known as book nooks. And Chris pledges to get comics from the Yeah guys, Art and Franco, into those boxes this July, which is cool. And Ed Cato is watching. Thank you, Ed. Yay for Word Balloon. That's very kind. Yay for Cartoonist Kayfabe as well, Ed.
Hey, man. Yay for comics, period.
Amen, son. Well, you know, and Jimmy, I know you and Ed feel the same way. We're all trying to entertain. We're all trying to do our own spin on stuff. And truly, man, I'm so glad you guys are doing what you're doing with Cartoonist Kayfabe. That is not fake praise at all. It's a fantastic show. You guys bring that artist's perspective to your interviews. You do great stuff, man. Great deep dives with a lot of some of my favorite magazines. One of the things you sent me, and that's this fantastic thing you're calling 1986. I'll let you describe it, and then I'll put some images up, and we'll scroll through it. So tell me about 1986.
It is a zine celebrating the year 1986 in comics because, certainly in my life, it's the best year, in a lot of ways in comics history. It's kind of this mythic year, and it really starts with Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns, which got press coverage in a bunch of mainstream media outlets like Rolling Stone and Spin Magazine, which at the time was unprecedented. And, I joke and say, like, it's Miller and DC throwing up the bat signal, like, from comic shops, because that's what happened. Is it drove this massive amount of interest into comic book shops. And that's the year that comic shops overtake the newsstand in terms of the sales of comics. And it really shapes a lot of what comics have come into. You can trace back to 1986 is really whenever that shift happens. And, comic fans really start to influence the direction of the market because the publishers are able to almost deal directly with fans through the comic shops. And 1986 is really where that hits critical mass. I mentioned Dark Knight Returns, but it's also the year Watchmen begins, Batman Year One, Elektra Assassin, one of my favorite books. Watchmen, of course, is 1986. A couple of years earlier, you had the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles self-published their first issue. That was 1984. By 1986, you had like an army of people self-publishing black and white comics known as the Black and White Boom. So that's very near the top of the activity that's happening in 1986. Marvel creates the new universe. John Byrne relaunches Superman. It's just this year where a lot of things come together at once. And it's not just a good year for comic book fans. It's also a year that brought a lot of people to comics who had either fallen off or maybe never even thought comics had something to offer them. And just the amount of good comics that came out in that short amount of time, it really changed the history of comics in a lot of ways. You'll hear pros, even like Joe Quesada, talking about the impact Dark Knight had on him and, kind of bringing him back to comics, eventually into a career in comics. And quite a few pros have a version of that story.
Well, I'm one of those fans, Jim. I was, that was in the middle of my college years. And I remember getting Rolling Stone magazine and seeing that article with Frank Miller about Dark Knight. And I'm like, I'd read this. This sounds amazing. And my local comic shop was within walking distance of my dorm. In fact, Tim Bradstreet, I was going to Illinois State University, and Tim Bradstreet was at Illinois Wesleyan down the street. And we would frequent the same comic shops and met each other as college students and stuff. And yeah, we laugh to this day about one of the comic shops that was down in Normal, Illinois, right by ISU and stuff. And you're right. It was a great time. Those black and white magazines, or rather the black and white comics. And I love talking to the creators, as I'm sure you guys do as well, that were part of that comic boom of the 80s. So many great books. There's an ad for Love and Rockets right there.
It's Dan Clow's first Fantagraphics work. Lloyd Llewellyn is published in 1986.
Yes.
And so, what happened is I would read in books about 1986 because there are so many big comics. So, there's a legacy there. But the more I started investigating, the more I started finding all sorts of interesting, like, what was this creator up to then? For instance, the 1986 zine is a paper publication. My background is in printed matter. I really love printmaking. And so I like making zines, I like making these books. And the centerfold of 1986, and centerfolds, for anybody that makes books and thinks about it, books tend to open to the centerfold, saddle stitched books like comic books. So I always say, like, if you can have a good centerfold, that's the next thing that people see when they pick up the book, and kind of flip through it because it just opens there. My centerfold is, what were the Image guys doing in 1986? Todd McFarlane starts his work on The Incredible Hulk. Rob Liefeld's first Youngblood printed appearance is in 1986. The Savage Dragon shows up in Megaton in 1986. So, it's pretty interesting. Jim Lee creates Wild Boys as a submission to get work at Marvel in 1986. And of course, Wild Boys is Wildcats once Image actually launches, five or 6 years later. But like 1986, there are all these different things that are happening. So the more I started looking, the more it was like this zine just kept growing. It started out as almost a collection, like a PDF that I was just making to entertain myself. And at some point, I do like printing and making these objects. And so I end up doing a print release of it this year. And it includes things like advertising art, which I love. And that's often where you would first see these characters or maybe a memorable cover. I have editorial content in here. I have the press release for The Dark Knight Returns, which I believe is done by Peggy Burns, Peggy May at the time, but I believe she was a publicist for DC Comics, now the publisher of Drawn and Quarterly. So, just having a press release for a comic in 1986 and having a publicity person or department pushing that book outside of the typical comic book ads, pretty revolutionary in itself. Yummy Fur begins publication in 1986, one of my favorite alternative comics. There's just a lot of energy that happens that year.
I couldn't agree more, man. And God, I really just looking through the zine, wonderful memories of some of these lesser known. I mean, right now I'm focused on the Dark Knight Comics interview issue. God, I blew it. I don't know if you guys got the chance to interview David Anthony Kraft. Yeah, you're shaking your head no. Okay.
I never met him, didn't have any correspondence with him. And it's funny because Comics Interview was not a big magazine for me. I start reading like late 80s, early 90s, and it there's still a little bit of Comics Interview, but it's kind of fading out at that point. And now I've been going back and reading them, and I love them. But it's 30 or 40 years later in some cases, so it's kind of strange.
Yeah, but Jim, these were like the Rolling Stone magazines of comics at that time. And I always point to them as saying they were a big inspiration for what I do with Word Balloon. I mean, I was devouring these magazines. Amazing Heroes was so great from Fantagraphics. And I always talk to, when I see Kurt Busiek at shows, or I talk to Wade. Wade was a big reviewer and contributor, as you well know. I love that you guys will go over these magazines and really break them down. And like you said, it's not only the big hits, but it is some of these indie books as well. I'm sure you've run across a number of ads for, was it the Southern Knights, a Southern superhero group? And man, well, wouldn't it be interesting if someone were to try Southern Knights in today's environment? Has that come up in conversation with you and Ed?
It hasn't. And I'll be honest, I have not read Southern Knights. I've seen quite a few copies over the years, but it's not a book that I've read. So I'm not sure how that content lines up exactly, but I like the idea of having superheroes that, presumably the book's created by somebody in the South. So it's almost like take these superheroes that we grew up reading that are all in New York. Let's put them in our, where we live. And, and that's part of what makes comics so great is that one person can make them, or, maybe a small team. They aren't that expensive. It's part of what made me fall in love with the black and white boom, because it was like, I always look at the Indicia pages. Where did this comic get made? And once people start self-publishing, then you find things from like, Iowa and Idaho and just every place you can imagine, you can find examples of these independent comics being made because you can do it. It's one of these great intimate forms of communication, but there's not a barrier of, you got to have a big budget. You have to have financial backers. You have to have a team of talent. Not really, like one person can do this stuff. And even if you're doing genre work, that still brings a very personal element to it.
We're looking now at a bunch of Dave Stevens covers, which, this was really Dave at his highest moment, I think highest watermark. You're right, though. I think of, like you said before, Love and Rockets. And Bendis and I have talked about Justice Machine coming out of Cleveland. I want to say Mike Gustovich. And Bendis, in fact, was telling me that was one of his earliest jobs in comics, was putting together mailers for the Justice Machine portfolio. And, and it's so funny because this is the era, too, when people say, I wasn't able to get every monthly comic. I'd catch them as they'd come out and stuff. That was certainly the case with the indies. I can't say I read every issue of Justice Machine, but that was one of my favorites of that era and stuff. And I got at least a decade on you, Jim. I know probably a little bit more. Again, like I said, '86 was my college years. How old were you? Were you coming to this stuff retroactively, or were you buying in '86?
I was coming retroactively. As I said, I start buying in probably 87, 88. But the legacy is a lot of that 86 stuff is around. Like I was buying at flea markets. I didn't really have a comic book store for a couple of years, really until I started being able to drive. So I was stuck with like whatever I could find, but there was a lot of product in 86, and that stuff would continue on because there would be dealers and, almost like baseball card dealers. Those sort of transition into comic book dealers at, like I say, flea markets and places where I would get access to them. And a lot of what I was buying were comics from the last couple of years because that stuff was still relatively current and relatively affordable. And the indie stuff just looked interesting to me. It would be things that, like, if it didn't have a Marvel or DC in the corner, it's like, what is this? There wasn't a place to get that information. So a lot of it was whatever you found and then like try to figure out what this is. Maybe the person selling it can tell you a little bit about it. Comic shops, I think that's one of the great resources. A lot of what I know and like about comics, I found in comic shops. So yeah, I wasn't buying in 86, but I bought a bunch of 86 books ever since.
Well, again, I hear what you're saying. And yeah, you're right. A lot of that 86 product did sit on the shelf beyond that year and stuff. But yeah, I mean, again, these titles, and these are quality creators who later became bigger. Oh, God, look at this fantastic stuff from Sienkiewicz of Elektra Assassin.
Some of these are quality, but I also have some of the bad ones. I saw you scrolled by a Silverwolf index, which is something I'm very proud to have in here. But Silverwolf was some of the, I hate to say bottom of the barrel because I find the comics themselves charming in a way and interesting.
Yes,
but it was definitely somebody who was taking advantage. It was a retailer, Chris Silver, and because he was retailing, he understood the success of the Turtles, and he just starts putting out black and white books in 86, 87, would continue publishing through a couple of different ventures into the early 90s. But I think a lot more of a cash grab than a trying to achieve a certain artistic height.
Yeah.
But I like that stuff, and so these are books that I still find today in 50-cent boxes or quarter boxes, or sometimes boxes addressed to the Cartoonist Kayfabe P.O. box. And
oh, that's great. People send them to you guys.
They do. Yes. So I have a pretty good collection of Silverwolf comics, but they're part of that. I find that stuff very inspiring. Like you mentioned, I'm an indie creator at the beginning of this. And I am. Most of what I do is self-published, or it's maybe with I worked with Ad House Books, which was a boutique publisher for many years. So that wasn't self-publishing, but it was very small. There were two of us, in terms of putting out a book then. So I admire this kind of DIY aesthetic and approach. Even if the comics themselves don't always land with me, it's still interesting to me to think like, a lot of people have done this. A lot of people, you grow up loving comics or loving the form, you have a story you want to tell, and then you go for it. And nothing's perfect, you know what I mean? But a lot of these indie comics, they have a lot of heart and charm, and sometimes that makes up for possibly the level of craft, or maybe the polish of a bigger publisher.
Agreed. Wow, I didn't realize. I remember this book from Joe Kubert, Tales of the Green Beret. I didn't remember that Shel Dorf edited the book. And of course, Shel Dorf, big part of the formation of San Diego Comic-Con, and helped a few big creators get their start in breaking into comics and things. Good stuff. Oh, Pumpkin Time. Good comments here. More power to Jim for being a loudspeaker for new artists. I appreciate Kayfabe's deep dives on unspoken artists for new readers and big two readers. You have lit a flame here in San Francisco for my homies, Bean Can Dan and Kurt Burdick.
Bean Can Dan is somebody that spent some time in Pittsburgh. I've known him for, going on 20 years now. And I don't know how long he's been in San Francisco, but a good cartoonist, and a cartoonist that improves with each project that he does. And Kurt Burdick is a creator of a bootleg Superman comic that we've showed off on the channel.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, definitely. Very fun. And, again, it's one of the things I like about comics, like it's full range in terms of who's making what, whether it's professional aspiration or it's hobby. One of the coolest comics I've been looking at lately is a comic book. I'll hold it up for everybody. It's Stories from a Vegas Street Cop, and by Chuck Calloway. This is a self-published comic that he sent us, and it has kind of a Dick Ayers, almost like Bronze Age kind of feeling. But he retired after 33 years as a policeman and started writing down things, anecdotes, memorable cases, things of that nature. And his son suggested, hey, why don't you illustrate those stories? And this is the result, So I don't know that Chuck is trying to get a job at, the big two or anything like that, but he has these great stories and loves comics. And as far as I know, this is his first comic, and it's pretty good. It's very readable. It looks good to me. It's in color. It's all this stuff that's exciting to me, with good stories on top, and stories that, quite frankly, are different than most of the comics that I see or have read, because these are his experiences. And, there are millions of cops represented in fiction and in nonfiction and in storytelling, movies, TVs, all these different places. I've never quite met one like the character in Chuck's book, because it's him, and it's real, even if these stories may be edited to make the best comics. It's still based on this real experience, and it creates a unique reading experience. So it's exciting to me to find stuff like that. And again, I hate to use the word hobby, but this isn't somebody who's looking to make a professional career. He's retired. What he's looking to do is make some cool art, make something that he's excited about. And I think that comes across.
I agree, man. And it's true that it seems, and better, Jim, is it easier now to make comics than some of the previous decades of examples? Certainly, you could put your stuff online a lot easier and print on demand, things like Amazon and things like that. Yeah, your thoughts on that?
I'm always cautious to tell anybody that it's easy. It's very, very hard to make a good comic. It's very hard to make a living through comics. Sure. However, both of those things are possible. And, there are more tools for making comics. And to your point, building an audience, getting your comics in front of people, whether that's online, whether it's through print on demand, crowdfunding. There's so many tools that are available now that literally didn't exist 20 years ago. When I started, and I started in 2000, and I was making indie comics and mini comics. And if you were doing that, you were working in black and white. That's it. There was no way you could do color. It was way too expensive, technical, all these different things. And that changed in the first decade of me making comics. That color became more affordable with digital technology and international trade. It really changed the game. And again, that's 15 years ago, maybe, whenever that becomes like, okay, we can all you could self-publish an edition of 50 copies and you can afford to do it in color. That's virtually unheard of in the 120-year history of comics. That's only been true for the last 15 years. So I wouldn't say that it's easier, but I would say that in a lot of ways, the field is more level than it's ever been. And certainly the tools that are available to us, because if you look at comics, and I know probably a lot of your listeners and myself included, we love a certain aesthetic. And that aesthetic is this big black line, heavy outline and shadows and everything with your flat colors. All of that style that so many of us associate with comic books is a result of limited technology. Like that was how we had to make comics in order to reproduce them. None of that's true anymore. We don't have any of those rules. You can still make them that way, and a lot of people choose to, and it's what a lot of us love aesthetically, but you no longer have to make them that way. And again, for the first 105 years, that's how you had to make comics. Not any longer, So like I saw a kid, I just did Big Apple Con this past Saturday in New York.
Oh, great.
And man, it was great. A lot of good energy, a lot of people coming through, and a variety of people from aspiring artists, young people, old people, collectors, fans, all kinds of different interaction with comics. But I saw a young kid come through with his dad. I don't know, he's probably 14, 15, something like that. And he had a comic that he had made. And I'm looking at it. And first of all, you have access to like tutorials. And I will meet people who their first comic looks like they should have been making comics for 20 years. Especially compared with my first comic. But I'm talking to this kid and his dad, and it's like, what we're asking about what we draw with each other, like, well, what do you draw with? you can draw with anything now and reproduce it. And again, like you couldn't do that 20 years ago. And it's like, you could do colored pencils, you can do ballpoint pens, you know, you can do fine lines, you can paint. I mean, imagine doing paint. When Bill Sienkiewicz did that multimedia Electra Assassin in 1986, they didn't even know how to pay him for that art. They paid him, I believe, a penciler, inker, and colorist fee because there was no idea of like, we're going to pay somebody to paint, we don't know how to do this. We barely know how to print them, you know? So it's exciting, I think, in every front in terms of making comics. What is available to us is just, I was saying with people over the weekend, you know, if Jack Kirby could see what was available now, and it includes business, you know, you can make this stuff yourself and distribute it yourself, and you are not stuck with one or two choices of which company do you want to screw you over. Like now, you know, we have freedoms that were literally undreamt of by previous generations when it comes to making comics.
You're so right, man. And again, all someone has to do is thumb through one of these 1986 comic magazines, criticism magazines, or promotion magazines, see the various fly-by-night companies, and as you say, how the technology changed. And that was kind of where I was going, Jim. No, nothing is easy as far as making something good. I completely agree with you. But again, it is the technology and everything. God, and think again, see, you guys have that perspective to ask Sienkiewicz that kind of question, or did he just offer it himself in conversation with you guys about getting paid as, you know, the combination? Because that's the kind of thing I would never think of asking.
I believe I read that in an interview. I don't think that was something that he said whenever we talked to him, but I believe I read that in an interview. Okay. To your point, with all these magazines that have had those interviews, you know, like I would read that stuff like a sponge trying to figure out how to make comics. You know, the information there was some out there, but it was still, you know, you had to dig for it. It wasn't like now YouTube, like whatever you want to learn to do, there's probably 1,000 videos that will help you.
Have you guys had Elsa Chartier on your show, the wonderful French artist?
No, but I follow her and I see some of her work on this approach, and that's what I mean. Like I see these people that are 19 or 20, and they have these comics that it would have been my favorite comic if I had seen it in like 1998. It would have been like the best thing I've ever seen, and now we just take it for granted. It's somebody's first comic. It's ridiculous, but it's because of people like her and other creators that just share, you know, the materials they use, the processes, what they see when they're looking at comics and successful comics. And, you know, I read, I got a collection of Frank Miller interviews one was with Carol Kalish. So it was when he was doing Daredevil, like early 80s, late 70s. There are 3 interviews in this magazine. I think it came out maybe in 1986. One of them is about Ronin, so like maybe 1983 or so, because he was working on issue 2 at the time of the interview. And then one with the Dark Knight. And I was joking with somebody about how much I like those old interviews. It's, you know, pre-Dark Knight media training, but it's also the language that's used to just talk about comics is completely different. There was no language. It's not like people were having the conversations that we have today where we're like breaking this stuff down and referencing Scott McCloud. And, you know, we have a wealth of info now that to talk like this is totally different than even professionals at the highest level of their game in the early 80s. There wasn't language around the art form then that we have now.
Well, and even the language has changed, as you say, in the last 15 or 20 years. Before I did Word Balloon, I bring it up every now and then. The University of Chicago had a great humanities weekend about comics. And Neil Gaiman interviewed Will Eisner. Scott McCloud was there. I'm trying to remember who else was there. But, God, it was great. And it was in this university setting, very casual, 300 people in the audience. And then everybody hung out afterwards, and you could talk to them. That was my meeting with Will Eisner. And I had a bunch of not only Warren, but kitchen sink spirits for him to sign. And it was great. He couldn't have been nicer. Gaiman was amazing, but a lot of what McCloud even taught in understanding comics. Have you gone back and again, because this is what I love about you and Ed too. You guys really do get into process and stuff. I mean, things have really changed. I mean, Scott should kind of, if you were ever inclined to do it, come back and make, you know, a new edition, because the game has changed so much from a technical standpoint.
It'd be interesting to see Scott come back and kind of reflect on that. I don't know that it, I have two thoughts on that. One is like, man, he's given so much, he doesn't know us anymore. It should be some young, somebody new should be weighing in on that. And they are, we have tons of books on the subject at this point. But it would be interesting to see his perspective, because he did codify a lot of the way we talk about comics and think about comics and the art form. So it would be interesting to see him come back and reflect on that. And he has, to some extent, with things like reinventing comics, and, he's put in a lot in that regard, of almost like mapping territory for critical discussion.
I want to catch up with the chat. Austin says, Cartoonist Kayfabe has helped me learn so much about comic history. Not enough great YouTube channels like it. Amen, man.
Thank you, Austin.
Zach says, I really enjoyed Local Man Gold. He wants to know, how did Street Angel get tied into that universe and series?
Tim Seeley is how Street Angel got in there. I've known Tim for a while, and he contacted me and about putting her into that issue, and told me what he had in mind. And it was like, yeah, it sounds great to me. I always think I'm happy to work with Image. They were so big to me whenever I was coming up. And so, like, to get to have a character published by Image and then get to have that character bounce around maybe in some other appearances, other books, other creators, it really makes me remember like the early days of Image, when it was so cool whenever you would get a little cameo or a guest spot from one of the creators' characters in another book. And so, it just seemed like a fun thing. And like I said, I've known Tim for a while, and pretty simple.
In the new year, I plan to talk to Rodney Barnes, who, speaking of which, in his book, Philadelphia, Spawn has been making appearances, which is perfect. And I know Rodney is over the moon.
Yeah, it's great to play with these things that, depending on your age, they're very important. And so, like, the chance to draw them or to bump them up against your character is very exciting.
Absolutely. Matt says, as an indie creator, publicity is definitely the most difficult part. Jim dropping profound knowledge in a well-stated way. I agree with Chris. And then Mike here. Let's see. Mike says, great chat so far. The good example that Jim describes in terms of opportunity is the manga One Punch Man that started with a very basic comic art line. And then also he loves the zine. 1986, an absolute seminal year creatively in U.S. comics. Is 1986 too revered? Seems like a lot of mainstream comics in the last 10 years try to repeat that success by doing homages, tributes, ripoffs. I don't think it's too revered.
It's so funny to see this question. I am reading Wizard Magazine number 62, which is from 1996. And I just last night read an article, and it's talking about Watchmen 10 years later, and about how many comics copied certain elements of Watchmen, and in the 90s, I would hear that a lot about how comics were grim and gritty, and they would sort of go back to 1986's Dark Knight Returns and to Watchmen. And that was what a lot of comics sort of pulled from those works, as opposed to maybe complex narrative structure or something along those lines. It's funny to have that conversation, that we continue to not just revere that year, but it continues to influence at least some of the content that people are making to this day. But that's how art works. Like, art refers to previous art, and 86 was pretty seismic on this art form. So there's a lot of reasons that lingers and continues to have an impact today.
And not only that, but I mean, certainly it's not the only moment. I mean, it is a big moment and a big shift, but we've had moments since then, and great books that have influenced other great books. What I love too, and it's funny, as I was scrolling through the zine, and I saw the turtle stuff, and as you say too, some of the knockoffs. That's what I remember were like adolescent radioactive hamsters and things like that. And it's like, gee, I wonder where that came from. It's what are you gonna do? But yeah, I appreciated the charm of the knockoff. You're right about describing it that way.
It's amazing. We got into something early in our Wizard coverage. I forget who the creator was. It might have been Bill Mouse, but I can't remember if that was right or not. He had done a lot of those parody comics. And so, like, I went through and found the list of the parody comics that he had done. And this was mostly in the early 90s. So, like, the Speculator bubble. And it was more than one page of printouts of the parodies that they had done. And you think about, you're doing a parody, you're probably going to sell a smaller percentage than the book you're parodying. but to be able to do like 50 of those, it really speaks to where the comics market was at that time, that those books were selling enough to generate profit.
Agreed. Have you had Jim McLaughlin on from Wizard or any of the other Wizard management? Because I came to Wizard, in the 90s. That was my post-college decade. Didn't have enough money to really buy comics, so I stayed away. I came back for things like Kingdom Come and Marvels, but I really didn't come back full until like 98 or 99 when Bendis was first doing Powers and Ultimate Spider-Man, and Brubaker and Rucka were doing Detective and Batman. Quesada had done, there's certainly Daredevil with Kevin Smith. And, I remember that. Quesada doing a really good Iron Man story that I remember. But I came to Wizard when it was kind of a balance, or when writers had become the dominant part of the writer-artist, combination. I know in early Wizard, they really leaned on the artist more. And I mean, so is that something you and Ed have discussed, the editorial change within Wizard as far as favoring artists versus writers and vice versa?
We have not, and I'm not sure we've gotten there yet. The last issue we covered, issue 61, so that would have been like 5 years, in, and it was September 96. And things are, it's really fascinating because the subtext is comics are spiraling, and how do we pull the nose up on this thing? Sales are plummeting. You're starting to see the ads shift. A lot of the advertisers from earlier issues maybe aren't advertising as much. Maybe there are fewer Marvel ads. Some of those companies, I don't want to say fly by night, but some of those smaller companies are going away. We're seeing like the last issue, or maybe no more ads. So things are bad financially, and we're coming up on the Marvel bankruptcy. Like they're going to be filing bankruptcy at the end of 96. So that's probably going to be in Wizard probably within the next 4 or 5 issues. And I'm eager to see how that was covered, because I was kind of out of comics. I was about as far out of comics as I got once I started reading when I was 10. I was about as far out in like 96, 97 as I got. I'm in college at that point. My college comic shop closed, during this downward spiral. I had no money anyway. So, like this is, and I was bored by a lot of like the Marvel DC Image stuff at that time. So a lot of the stuff that we're now covering in Wizard and in 90s comics history, I kind of remember, but not very accurately. And it's eye-opening to see it. But the last issue of Wizard that we covered, issue 61, the editorial starts out, and you can see that even like Wizard isn't sure what's going on. And they talk about listening to the fans and what the fans want more coverage of. And it's indie comics, it's manga, and it's toys. Those are the 3 things that he calls out. And I was like, if you swap toys with graphic novels, it would have been very prescient as to like where comics have gone in the last decade. But my point of saying all that is I can see them pivoting somewhere, like right now they're kind of like swaying in the wind, like what is happening with the comics industry? What do we cover? And I could see that leading to writers, and it makes perfect sense, because that's something that shifts at some point where, I say post Dark Knight media training, but there's also one of your commenters mentioned publicity. These writers are much better at writing a press release, or maybe contributing it on an article, almost ghostwriting an article. So it would make sense to me why you might go to some of these writers, because it's perfect. I'm writing an article, you're a writer. We speak the same language here. Marvel, I think Marvel made a very conscious decision that we are not making superstar artists anymore. We did that, and that went badly for us. And so I think there were editorial pivots to focusing on writers. And if that's true, Wizard would have followed suit. That would have been who the Marvels and the DCs were sort of connecting to Wizard. If they made a conscious decision to promote the writers, that's who they would have been feeding to Wizard and whatever media outlets they could get. So, I'm aware of that shift. I don't know when it happens. We haven't gotten there yet.
That's something, again, to talk to with Quesada and Palmiotti, who were the brains behind Marvel Knights. And whenever I have them on, Jim, that is exactly what I want. I mean, I'm happy to promote whatever they're currently doing, but I am like, tell me about that moment, because again, now there's a non-1986 moment where those guys come into Marvel, and Marvel thankfully recognizing the energy and ability that they brought and the group of guys they assembled to make those great comics and stuff. I think that was a big game changer. And yeah, I wonder, because also two real artists, and yet, you know, again, where they knew that writing was so important and stuff, but they had Chris Priest with them, and I'm blanking on who wrote the Inhumans that Jay Lee drew. Was it
Paul Jenkins?
It was Paul. Of course, it was Paul Jenkins. Another friend that, yeah, it's like, oh, dude, shame on me. Sorry, Paul, if you're watching.
Yeah, and as Joe Quesada gets promoted to editor-in-chief, you know, I feel like it continues that. The Marvel Knights was really the tryout or whenever they recognize this is going to work. But as he moves into that editor-in-chief role, it really does create a huge momentum. And there are a number of great writers that come out of that tenure. You know, you mentioned Bendis a minute ago. He joins up there pretty early on. I think of like Grant Morrison coming on for New X-Men and Marvel Boy. Mark Miller, you know, there's a list of writers, Brubaker with Captain America, that really, you know, they made good work. They made work that got people very excited for the work they were making. And, you know, there was a real sense that like they did pull the nose of the plane up. You know, they did really change the direction that things were going. And again, from the outside, I wasn't a big Marvel guy. But from the outside, it was, you know, I watched with skepticism in the beginning and cannot deny what they accomplished. You know, it really was impressive.
Agreed. And hey, man, I got to tell you, I was born a DC guy more so than Marvel as far as the big two. And I got to say, when I look back at that period, you know, Rucka used to make the analogy that DC and Marvel were the tortoise and the hare, and that Marvel was the hare, always sprinting, always innovating and stuff. And all of a sudden, there comes the tortoise, and DC would like latch on to a group of creators and stuff. And all of a sudden, we'd get great books. In that late 90s period, no disrespect to a lot of the people that were working there, but yeah, Marvel had the juice with Marvel Knights and that stuff. No, it's again, Jim, this is the shared, I think, fascination that I have with you guys. And it's like, well, how did we get here? What steps were taken that were the lead steps? And we're in this weird period right now, I think, with the big two. And I don't mind people talking about it. Good comics are being made. I mean, I certainly can appreciate a lot of what the big two is putting out right now. But I also know that really the Image and not only the Image books, but these other publishers, as you said earlier, I think Vault is making a lot of great stuff. I think Mad Cave blows my mind at the quality of books and also licenses that they've picked up lately. There's just a lot of good comics publishers out there alongside, and they are taking care of other genres. And I think that's really smart too. It's like, look, you know, let DC and Marvel do the superhero game. We want Western comics. We want good horror comics. You know, we want good romance comics. So
I would go one step further too, in terms of the conversation of where comics are today, because I did hear a few people complain at Big AppleCon about the state of comics, this or that. And I think like, then look at something else, because in addition to all the contemporary new comics that are being produced, in a traditional comic book format, we also have access to reprints of some of the greatest comic strips ever done. And whenever I was younger, that stuff was very hard to find, very expensive, and often not a very good quality. Now it's great quality and there's more of it than ever. So, you know, if you get really bored with what Marvel's doing, pivot to the left and see what you see over there. You know, turn around and see what's behind you in, like I say, comic strips, manga. I saw where Drawn and Quarterly just published a Garo mangaka, which is sort of the underground comics in Japan. So, you know, we have access to some very, very good manga, you know, like the companies from Viz to Drawn and Quarterly, Fantagraphics, what is being made available to us very easily, you know, like a comprehensive Fist of the North Star reprint series, you know, like great stuff, whatever your taste is. I find it hard to believe that there's not something that you would love if you like comics, you know, and all the digital stuff, you know, the webtoons, like there is so much comic content available right now, easily, like accessible. I just, you know, if you're really not happy with what you've been looking at, look at something else if you want more comics, because everything is out there right now.
Jabba says, Floating World published all of Rich Tomaso's Patreon magazine. And I agree with Matt. Matt says, I believe Gamal Hennessy said that the big two now are actually Scholastic and Viz. Made sense. And I think all of that answers Zach's question. If we think comics need Marvel and DC to survive. Survive is a weird word, Zach, because it would be a different marketplace. But I suppose from a direct market standpoint, there's the importance of DC and Marvel. That's not the only distribution model, though. And in fact, I had a conversation. Pardon me, Jim. I'm burping while we're talking because I'm drinking water while we're talking. But last week I talked to Rich Johnson about some of the issues right now, and I really we talked about the price of DC and Marvel and things like that, and I understand why comics cost as much as they do. But as we say, that's not the only distribution platform. And a few of the people in the chat are like, "Well, when are we going to get kids to want to read the comics we read?" It's like, that's not our job. Any one of our jobs. It's let the kids decide what they want to read. If reading Dogman and Renee Telgemeier and some of the other Scholastic stars and stuff lead them to a different form of comics, great. It's a big comic book world. I believe all that stuff will still be published. And certainly, as Gamal pointed out, the market for Scholastic, Viz, and some of the others is obviously much bigger than what DC and Marvel are putting out. DC and Marvel are doing it, I think, as a favor and a thank you. Thankfully, there are enough executives out there that understand that the inspiration for the TV and movies that generate the big dollars are these books. And, back in the day, and I don't know if you ever found this, Jim, thank God for Paul Levitz, because there was a moment in the late 70s, early 80s where Warner's was like, maybe we don't need to make comics anymore. And Levitz is like, no, this is your IP laboratory to create new things and make other things that you can make TV and film from. And thankfully, the execs upstairs listen to him. And I think right now, in both companies, there are enough executives that see the value of DC and Marvel. So that was my essay. What are your thoughts on all that BS, Jim?
Let me start with a comment a couple ago. The Rich Tomaso Floating World published books, I think they're called Black Phoenix, I want to say is the name of that. He's also doing a new series, Still Black Phoenix. I don't know if it's part of his Patreon magazine or if it's like new comics based on that, but they're really nice books and they're affordable. And I like Rich Tomaso's cartooning quite a bit. And I think it's a good book for fans of comics and fans of Tomaso. But in terms of Marvel and DC, comics don't need them at all. Comics is an art form. It really doesn't need any particular publisher, platform, imprint, any of that stuff. The marketplace is a different conversation. And honestly, I have gotten to know a lot of comic shop retailers. And before I did, I always thought of that as that's one group, comic shops. That's a thing. It's like they're a union or something, not a union, but almost like they're the same thing. And they
like-minded. Yeah. One mind.
A bunch of independent businessmen, entrepreneurs in most cases. And as getting to know them and kind of like asking questions and seeing how they operate, I haven't seen any two comic shops that operate the same way, which is really good for survival of a species. Comic shops have done a lot better than most brick and mortar businesses, retail businesses have. And I think part of that is because they are run so differently. And honestly, I want to see them tell us how to evolve and what to keep doing, because they had a pretty good track record over the last 40 or 50 years, comic book shops. And I expect that to continue. And I expect comics to probably respond in a lot of ways to their direction, because they really are the ones who are making money from comics. If the lights are still on, they are figuring out a way to make the marketplace work. And we need to support them the best way we can and listen to them, because they actually know about selling comics. I don't, and I make comics, and the person, everybody has these opinions, but very few of us actually have the experience. It's one thing to opine. It's another thing to bet your livelihood on it. And for the men and women who have been put in that position, I'm curious to hear what they have to say, because I think personally, many of the comic shop owners that I'm friends with, they have found ways to do well over the last few years in this business. And so, let's see what they think and what direction they want to go. But there's a lot of great comics out there. It's a matter of figuring out how do you leverage that if you're selling them to make your business successful. And it seems to be different for each spot.
I'm always happy when another creator is watching Word Balloon and here's Kelly Jones and saying two great comic people talking. This makes me happy. Well, thank you, Kel. We're glad you're out there. You talked to Kel and Matt about Dracula, didn't you, Jim?
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of Kelly Jones and Matt Wagner's work. So it was really cool to talk to Kelly Jones, but it's been really great just looking at his work on the channel as well. Very exciting, but yeah, it was nice talking with him, and hopefully we'll do it again because what a career.
Oh, good Lord. I have a friend in sports broadcasting who has put out, and certainly he's been in the business for almost 50 years, knows everybody. And the name of his podcast is Tell Me a Story I've Never Heard. And he's gone through his Rolodex and it's like, well, I'm going to wrap up the show. I'm like, you can have them back. They have more than one story to tell. Yes. And I'm trying to convince him to do it because he gets all the big people based here in Chicago, but like really everyone nationally that he knows. And I'm like, dude, and Kelly's a great example of that. I love talking to Kelly. He's been on several times. We still haven't cracked the code on everything that he's done, and he keeps making more great stuff. So, no, I absolutely hear you. Well, let's talk about more of your great stuff. And this great true crime funnies. I'm going to bring it up in a second. And tell me about this new book of yours, Matt. Or Jim, yeah, I'm sorry, Jim. I called you Matt. Sorry.
I was making stories last year without a destination in mind. Just kind of I carved out some time, so make the comics I want to make. And I started making some biographical comics about a cop, George Hunter White, who was a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent in the 40s, 50s. I think he retired in the 60s. So doing some research on him, I kind of became fascinated with his story and made a comic about it. Now I'm actually making more comics about him right now. That's what's on my drawing table. The other two, there are 3 stories in this comic. This is like a one-man anthology, like an 8-ball or something. I grew up with Yummy Fur, these alternative comics. So there are 3 stories in here, and the other 2 are wrestling stories. If you know me very well, I'm a big fan of professional wrestling. And so I have a story about Frank Gotch, considered by many to be the greatest professional wrestler of all time. Before he won the heavyweight championship, when he was still relatively unknown, he went to the Klondike during the Gold Rush and probably did the greatest work in the history of professional wrestling. He basically worked the territory and left there with a lot of gold. And then the other wrestling story here is Andy Warhol's encounter with Dusty Rhodes, the American Dream, based on Andy Warhol's diary. And I heard about it on a podcast, and it was like, oh, I got to go see, is this true? What's actually in there? And he pretty much has a diary entry about a night that he hung out with Dusty Rhodes in New York City after some Madison Square Garden matches. And I'm in Pittsburgh, Andy Warhol's very big here. So the chance to do a wrestling story with Andy Warhol and Dusty Rhodes was too good to pass up. And it's me doing comics that entertain me, that I enjoy. And so I am pretty much, this is what I'm working on now. I just make comics, like short stories and stories that I enjoy. In the case of the George Hunter White story, that may turn into a graphic novel. If I keep filling out the chapters of his life, eventually that may be a graphic novel. But until then, I've got a couple more chapters underway. They're complete adventures. They're in the tradition, true crime funnies in the tradition of crime comics. I've really gotten into some of the golden age crime comics, and they're built as 8-page stories, 6-page stories, 10-page stories. A lot of them are true crime. They're based on famous gangsters and famous cases. And so that's kind of the approach I'm taking with this George Hunter White stuff. And I find that the chapters, at least so far that I've worked on, they feel like satisfying, complete stories. It'll be like a case that he worked, or, something along those lines where it's like, yeah, it's part of a bigger story probably, but it's also, I hope, a compelling story on its own.
It's great. Honestly, Jim, the whole comic is great. And I loved the Dusty Rhodes Warhol story as well. And I'm a boxing guy, like you're a wrestling guy, as far as history of the sports. And no, it's terrific. I had the pleasure in the '90s to get to know a lot of the guys that were part of the WWF then, and especially like Bobby Heenan. And I loved many lunches and dinners in the '90s with Bobby. And I'm like,
Wow.
tell me everything about the territory days, because I just think that whole period is ridiculously fascinating. I love Young Rock, that NBC show. I don't know the status of it, of when it's coming back. I'm sure the strike probably screwed up its production schedule, but I just hang on every episode watching the Hawaiian territory days of his grandparents and his parents and everything. And it's like, this is great. This is what I love. Aubrey, Aubrey Sitterson. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. The comic editor and stuff. He's a big wrestling fan. And he's like, you want to come on a wrestling podcast? I'm like, only if we could talk about the territory days. And he's like, oh, we really just do more coverage of, every Monday night or all the various nights of wrestling, what's going on and stuff. And I'm like, I don't watch anymore, man. For me, it was those days on UHF when I was a little kid. Bob Luce was our big territory promoter. And God, oh my God, again, the stories that Bobby Heenan would tell of traveling through Chicago. I'm like, again, tell me everything about Bob Luce. Tell me about Dick the Bruiser, the Crusher from Milwaukee. These people, so I can appreciate your fascination.
I'll tell you what.
Roads,
if you were going to pick somebody in wrestling to have some lunches with and hang out with, I can't imagine doing better than Bobby Heenan. Every story I've ever heard about him is how fantastic he is. And yeah, that's really something, man. That's special.
Dude, I was really lucky. Those 16 years in sports radio, I got to really meet a lot of fun people. And and now again, with Word Balloon, I'm enjoying the same thing with comic book people. But yeah, man, no, I love your art as always. And I think back to Octobriana and some of your other great past hits as well. Is this available now to purchase?
It is. It's available on my website, jimrugg.com. It's also available there as a digital file. Sometimes, I have been self-publishing, so I just started selling them on my website, and I will sell out print runs. That has happened, although I currently have True Crime Funnies. I also put them on my Patreon, so my patrons get downloadable like PDFs whenever I finish them. Sometimes stories in progress, like all the stories in True Crime Funnies, went through my Patreon first. So a few different ways you can get them, and a handful of stores have picked those up directly from me. So I should have a list of stores handy so I can plug those. But I'm trying to get it out there. I want my comics to be as easy for people to get as possible, and whether that's a local store or online. I try to make it available.
I'm scrolling through for people to see some of your great images of this first story. Now, great stuff, Jim. Truly.
Thank you.
What is your convention schedule look like for 24?
The only schedule I have, the only show I have scheduled so far is Heroes, a show that I've been doing now for almost 15 years. Love that show. I joke and say it's almost like going home. It's kind of family. So it's a great show run by the Heroes Aren't Hard to Find store and staff, led by Shelton Drum. And he's got I'm so impressed with that show, to be doing it. I think they've been doing it 40 plus years. The fact that people keep coming back every year, the pros. And I think it speaks a lot to Shelton and the way he runs that show. I think everybody loves it. That's the only show that I've scheduled as of now. I'll probably pick up a few more. I'd done Big Apple this past weekend, and that was the first time I did a New York show since before COVID. And so, I may try to go to some places I haven't been before, or places I haven't been in a long time. We'll see. It's interesting because my work tends to straddle, there are a lot of like small press shows, like SPX is a show that I've done quite a bit. Cake in Chicago, one of these small press shows. There are several of those around the country, and I like those, and I've done well at those shows. But I've also, like, at this point, I've done work for Marvel, and, I can kind of do either type of show. And when you factor in Cartoonist Kayfabe as a way to promote where we're going to be, it kind of makes me want to go on the road a little bit more. And like I say, to places I haven't been, to meet some new fans.
We got to get you at Terrificon, my buddy Mitch Halleck's show in Connecticut. Yeah, I think you'd do well there. And
New England is one of the places on my list. They have Mice, I think, is the Massachusetts. I think that's a Boston show of like indie, kind of an indie focus. But there are several shows in New England. There's an indie creator show that I think this coming year is their first year. I think that's in Connecticut. Terrificon, I think I may have talked to that promoter somewhere. So we will see. I did a show in Cincy probably 5 or 6 years ago. The show that Tony Moore was like the co-creator of. Had a great time
we were both
there.
That's right, Cincy Comic-Con. Absolutely, man.
So yeah, it's it can be an excuse to travel to different places. So I'm trying to figure out some of that.
All right, some requests for you to go to the Northwest as well. Why
not?
I
appreciate that. West Coast Dave Vengers. He's a King Kayfaber, so we hang out with him whenever we record Cartoonist Kayfabe. And he actually sent me a really nice Christmas gift, a comic I had been looking for. He came across, he knew it was something that was on my wish list, and really delivered. I did Emerald City whenever Aphrodisiac was first released. That was the first show I ever did when that book was out. Might have even been right before the book came out. Sat next to Tim Sell, who had a massive line and was the nicest guy all weekend and kept that line like away from my, so it wouldn't cut me off. But I had a great show there. So yeah, I'd love to go back to the Pacific Northwest. And, like a lot of these good comics towns, they have the small press shows and the big shows. And, by big, I mean the Marvel DC mainstream shows. So a lot of options out there. It's kind of amazing the number of conventions, because that wasn't around whenever I started it either. There were like SPX and Ape, I think, were the two small press shows whenever I started in 2000.
There you go, man. Yeah, and I remember when they were brand new shows. What do you want to tease, if you want to tease anything, of upcoming episodes for Kayfabe?
Gosh, it's so hard to tease stuff because we put this stuff together. We do a week's worth of shows. We are continuing Wizard coverage. That seems to have spiked again in terms of interest and feedback from the fans. I don't know exactly when we're going to do it, but I've been going through Robert Crumb's Genesis. So that's probably going to be a book that we look at some point. We've looked at a few Crumb examples. I've been thinking a lot about Bible comics. I was raised in a very religious house. And so it's something that I'm interested in kind of, because of that background. Part of the reason I've been looking at Crumb's Genesis is I was reviewing the story of the Tower of Babel, where I wanted to look at it again. And so that's what I pulled that book out specifically for. And then I just kind of get sucked in because it's amazing. But I was thinking about Chester Brown did those biblical adaptations in the back of Yummy Fur and Underwater. So there's somebody sent us copies of the EC comics, the Bible stories or
picture stories of the Bible.
Yeah. Okay. So, like there's this history of that kind of material that I find really interesting. And we haven't done too much of it. We looked at Jack Chick tracks on an episode, but
Jim, I love this. I've told this before. I worked at a bank when I was trying to make ends meet. And there was some guy that through the drive-through would put the Jack Chick comics in the pneumatic tubes and send them and drive away.
That's
and it's
amazing.
like, and they're like, Suntress, you like comics, check this stuff out. And that was my first exposure to those crazy Jack Chick. You're going to go to hell if you don't watch yourself.
What a phenomena those things are. Talk about a strange comics.
Oh, yeah.
I don't even want to say niche. I think there might be a billion of those things out there. So, we're going to keep going forward. We have a wish list of people we want to talk to. So we'll get back to interviews. It's pretty interesting. It's almost like we do seasons. It's not really planned that way, but, we do take breaks and travel and we record episodes ahead of time. So it's not a break from the broadcast, but it is like record. And then maybe we take a couple of weeks off and recently Ed went to Japan. So we had a little break. But now that he's getting back probably post holidays, we'll start up with some interviews again. And I mean, you never run out of people you want to talk to because we don't have a policy like your friend. Maybe we'll talk to the same person a couple of times. We've had several guests come back. So, I think we'll have some good guests coming up in the new year. Is probably something to look forward to, and keep trying to push forward.
Regarding the religious comics, are you going to look at? I've never read them, but I know that Archie had those Chuck White. Mm-hmm. And I think they were Catholic comics, but I know Chuck White was. And in fact, if you watch, I think they put Chuck White on either Archie or the Brady Kids, one of those Filmation early 70s things. And that's how I knew who Chuck White was. But then I heard in a George Carlin routine him talking about reading Chuck White comics when he was a kid, and I did a little more investigating. I've yet to read them, but again, it's this weird side of Archie, and I don't mean weird in a negative way. But yeah, that I just had no idea that they were making those kind of comics. Have you read them? Are you aware of those?
No, I'm kind of aware of them. I think I know the ones you're talking about, where they are like Archie, the Archie characters, right?
I don't even know, but I know it was the same writers and artists that were doing Archie and stuff. Were doing so Dan DeCarlo and these other guys were doing Chuck White comics as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, and maybe one I'll look at. I have like the this is it Spire Comics, which were Al Hartley, and they were like God's Smuggler and the Switchblade, the Swastika, and something. They're these comics. The way I would find some of these would be in collections of like weird comics, and you'd go through and it would be like these strange religious comics from the 70s. But if you look at those, they look almost like Archie comics. There's one about Johnny Cash, which I don't have and haven't read, but I think it's sort of about him, finding God and getting back on the right path, or at least struggling with those demons. So I have my comic books in order, and I have like Christian comics as a section. I have romance comics as a section. Mostly I store them by title, but I do have a couple of these like genre collections because it's very hard to find that stuff. But Jack Chick would also publish full-size comics, so I have a big batch of those. They were, I think, Crusade or Crusaders was the sort of like the corner box imprint, and that they range from like Noah's Ark to much more strange things. Marvel had comics that were like the Pope,
right?
So they've done a little bit with religious comics as well.
Ironically, Stephen Grant, who did one of the most violent Punisher stories of the 80s, also did the John Paul the second.
How else could it go?
And I love that. Steve's another guy that's been on many times. If you haven't had him on, he'd give you some excellent stories. Zach wants to know if you guys take requests for kayfabe guests.
We take requests. It doesn't mean that we're going to do it. It doesn't mean that we can do it either. It's
sure.
A lot of factors to put together an interview. It's much more daunting than it appears, if you're watching it at home. But scheduling and things that can be a challenge.
That's why I do interviews around the clock, Jim. I was helping Rom V out doing one, afternoon time here in Chicago, and it was evening time in England and stuff. No, I'm happy to do that. Whatever accommodates a creator to get a good interview. Because as you know, it's great to have the live audience, but these things have an evergreen shelf life, and it's okay if they're not live as far as the audience goes. Pardon me. As I cough. Too many cigars. Not really.
It's also great. Like, you want to get these people on record because life's short. If you live to be 100, it still goes by very fast. So you want to sit down with these people and really get as much of their story as you can. It's something that I often look back on. Like, we're so lucky now to have footage of your favorite artist. You can probably find footage of them drawing, which is amazing. Like, I would give anything. Like you have, I think there's one video maybe of Jack Kirby doing a pencil drawing. There's almost no footage of that kind of material, and there's not a lot of footage of like recordings of these guys talking. So, I often think when we finish an interview, like, I'm so glad we got to talk to that person and get that on record, because, man, we're getting to that age where every year, now some of my favorite artists pass, and that's not going to change. That's inevitable. That's part of this journey.
Absolutely. And also, I always say pre-90s, there's a lot of podcasts out there that and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but they get history wrong. And it's really great to get the story straight from the people who were actually there. So there's a lot of speculation. My favorite punching bag is Vinnie Coletta. And don't get me wrong, Vinnie Coletta did a lot of things that probably drive a lot of fans nuts, but he did good things too.
I agree with you completely.
And I know you do, Jim, because you get the real story from the people that work with Vinnie and others. And it's like, here's along with erasing a lot of Jack Kirby lines to get the job done by 9 a.m. the following morning, he also, my favorite story is that he saved Marshall Rogers and Englehart on the Joker laughing fish story, because DC was like, all right, these guys are late. Let's jettison this. And then he went to bat for him because he was the art director. Then he's like, this is a great story. You got to let these guys finish the story. And it's one of the classic Batman stories. So
wow, I never heard that. That's amazing. That's great. Yeah, I like his inking just fine, but there is so much more to those stories, and it is often deadline. When
yes,
I don't know that he's choosing to erase figures because he's lazy or hates the artist or whatever. It's deadline. It's something that I think, and I've heard more and more stories, as I've gotten to know more pros, but often like we'll look at a book and you'll be like, that art's just, it's not that good. Or, I hear about this artist, but then like this issue doesn't look very good. And we don't know that maybe that script arrived and he had a week to draw it. And that happens much more often, I think, than you realize when you're just pulling a comic off the rack and reading it. Like 100%. There are nightmare stories. I would bet that it's more often than not that you had a shorter time span. It's not like, okay, you've got, 30 days on each script. No, that is not the history of periodical comics. It's probably a lot more unusual than the norm.
You're 100% right. And I know production guys like Chris Iliopoulos telling those kind of horror deadline stories where he's got to make it work before it goes to the printer. No, you're absolutely right. Jim, as always, great conversation. I love what we've been talking about. I'm so happy for you. Again, everybody, True Crime Funnies available now, and Jim's excellent zine about 1986. So jimrugg.com, Jim, is that your website?
That's a good place to go.
There you go. Excellent. And again, Cartoonist Kayfabe right here on YouTube, one of the best shows out there. And I'm glad you guys are doing it because we need more good quality audio and video covering comics. And truly, I love your guys' show. And sometimes I avoid it when I see we have a like-minded guest because I don't want to be influenced by your interview. So I'm like, all right, that's cool. I'm glad we're all thinking along the same lines. But, we all want to do our own thing. So excellent stuff, Jim, truly. And always a pleasure. I hope to see you this year in person at one of these shows. And thanks a lot for always coming back.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.
Thanks for everybody watching. It's going to be an interesting week here at Word Balloon. If all goes well, I'll be talking to Christopher Priest. Who else have I got coming up? God, I've got it all written down. Well, I know Priest is coming up. Sal Crivelli, another great YouTuber. Comic Pop, great channel. He'll be on as well. And we'll go from there. But at least those two, and of course, Jimmy tonight. So should be a good pre-holiday situation. Of course, everybody, if we don't see each other until the holiday's over, everybody have a Merry Christmas, including Jim. And, all the best to everybody. And look for more great stuff from Word Balloon to close out December. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody.